record to the cloud. What I'd like to do is, as we've been saying, all of our presentations eventually will go up on the WCA website. They will go up on a new Facebook page, and we will find a way to put them on YouTube for viewers. We've had a lot of people reach out to Cheng and to myself and to others about wanting to watch the presentations afterward, which is really good because right now some of our European colleagues are sleeping. Just like last night, most of our American colleagues, except for KJ, were sleeping during the presentations. And so it's really good to actually share these, particularly since we've opened up the conference for more and more people. It'd be great to use some of these presentations for other pedagogical reasons, and especially with WCA's vision to be open to as many as possible, as we look to places like Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Malaysia, Indonesia, other places where we have members. These can be great learning tools. And so that's why putting these online later is really beneficial. So we'll be able to track viewership as well. So what I'd like to do is today we're going to be talking about the research we've been doing on dissent and immediacy in the time of COVID, particularly looking at the US, the UK, and Australia. And one second here. Sorry, there's random emails coming in just to make sure people are none of the problems with the conference. So, and that's not a problem. That's just everything's good. Okay. I wanted to let people know who are watching that this is part of a much larger project that we've been doing through Massey and also through other researchers around the world. We have probably about 20 to 22 different countries that we've been working with on COVID, but this project focuses on just 3, the US, the UK, and Australia, and is particularly interested in organizational communication behaviors. And so one of the things we've been focusing on is really the idea that COVID changed how we communicate organizationally. And so what we're going to do today is, this is not the whole group, there's other members of this group. So there's probably about 12 or 13 of us who've been working on these papers. And so what we're going to do though is divide up a short presentation talking about really one of the papers that we've done and really go through really some of the key theoretical constructs, some of the ways in which we've studied this, some of our findings just in summary. We're not going to go through large tables and, we're not going to bore you with mathematics and stats, but basically talk about general results, even though it wouldn't bore me and some of our other people in here. Stephanie and I particularly would love to go through the squiggles, as someone calls them, but just talk about general findings for people, and then you can reach out to us for more specifics if you're interested. But then talk about where to from here. So what I'd like to do is I am going to share screen here and show you a bit of a PowerPoint. And I have to thank George for his lovely help on this. So you can see the PowerPoint here. Let me just, I'm normally working on like 3 or 4 screens. So having just one is really hard for me. It's my laptop only. Is workplace dissent and immediacy in the US, UK, and Australia during the time of COVID. So our panelists, just so I can introduce everybody, is hello, I'm Stephen Croucher. For those of you who don't know me who are watching later, and I'm not only the president of WCA, but I am the head of school at Massey University and a lead research fellow at the National Research University, Higher School of Economics in Russia. With us, we have Tao Nguyen, who is a doctoral student at Massey University. Tao could wave, she's there. We have Kenneth Rocker at Massey University as well, KJ, who is in North Carolina and not in New Zealand yet, but hopefully just waiting for border stuff. Those of you who don't know, New Zealand has shut its borders as part of our COVID response, which we'll talk about more later as we talk about the different countries. Stephanie Kelly, North Carolina A&T State University, the lovely building and flowers behind her. Chen Wei, or Melissa, is here as well. She is in Auckland, also at Massey University. George Ding, Massey University, who has San Francisco behind him in his screen. Doug Ashwell, also at Massey University, who has the Coromandel Peninsula behind him. And Joe Cullinan from Massey University, who isn't here today, but is part of this project. And there's others who are part of the project as well. So We'll start off with why these countries, and who would like to talk about why these countries? I think George is, correct? So if you can unmute yourself, George. You're on mute.
Sorry about this. Yeah. Thank you, Stephen, and hello everyone. So my part of the presentation about the research context of this study, about the 3 countries we have picked for the COVID-19 responses and the workplace communication. So firstly, why these 3 countries? Because this study is a part of a wider project and explores how remote work impacted superior subordinate relationships during the pandemic, and there are also communicating prejudice against the Asian immigrants in the world. And there are common ground to compare the 3 countries. That means the 3 countries, they are comparable. Firstly, they are all English-speaking countries, and culturally, they are all rooted in Anglo-Saxon cultures and with Christian and Catholic religious beliefs. And all these countries are experiencing COVID-19 pandemic. And there were different degrees of lockdowns in these countries. And this is, we think this is not very good, unfortunate though, but it is occasion to examine how people cope with public health crises. And it is also an opportunity to examine organizational communication behaviors in different countries, and then we can refer back to workplace culture theories. And the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So about the government response to the pandemic, firstly, about the USA, the first confirmed case occurred in January 2020, and it spread very quickly to all the 50 states in only 2 months' time. So by April this year, that's the end of the data collection, there was 31 million confirmed cases and over 569 related deaths. It was due to late response to the pandemic from the federal government, and because at the Trump administration, he was unwilling to impose national lockdowns and restrictions due to economic and political considerations when he was seeking the second presidency. And so at the time, the White House tried to downplay CDC recommendations. So we all watched the scenarios from TV press conference about the Trump versus Fauci, the director of CDC's recommendations on the pandemic control, and also Trump's stories about the blitz cure COVID-19, and Trump politicalized mask wearing with his party GOP. In this study, we picked the 3 states, the New Mexico, Florida, and California, and the states enforce different degrees of business closure, mask mandates, and stay-at-home orders. Yeah, thank you. And while in UK, the first case was confirmed in January 2020. And by April this year, there was 3.8 million confirmed cases and more than 100,000 related deaths. So compared to the population of this country, these numbers are also very terrible. And it was just caused by the complex and the confusion responses from the government, because in this country, they have different legal systems, England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And they have, asymmetrical responses to the epidemic. And at the very beginning, Boris Johnson's government also used or employed the herd immunity approaches. For those people with COVID-19 symptoms, the government suggestion was just, have self-isolation or elderly to stay at home, to rest home without testing. And there was no restrictions on public gathering at this time. And the UK finally imposed lockdown in late March when they passed the Coronavirus Act in that month. And the next page, please. Thank you. And Australia has been successful compared to the other two countries in controlling COVID-19 pandemic. So the first case was confirmed in this country in March 2020. By April this year, there was 29 the cases and about 900 related deaths. And it was just due to very early international and state border closure. And the government mandated home isolation and then transferred to the hotel quarantine system for overseas detainees. And the government subsidies and the benefits to affected businesses and the unemployed people. And there were vigilant testing, tracing, and quarantine measures. So far, Australia has tested more than half of its population. And they have very swift lockdown restrictions, and they have timely public crisis communication via TV, press conference, advertising, and other media outreach. And so from this study, we have got these results. Firstly, superior's computer-mediated immediate behavior and the perceived immediacy both positively predict articulated dissent. And some aspects of—
George, I think if we can talk first about immediacy, if we can maybe go through, we didn't have a—
Okay.
If we could ask folks to talk about, we wanted to go through those because those take a bit more detail on those, but if we could also ask, if I could bring Stephanie Kelly in to talk a bit about what immediacy is, and then I'll have Melissa come in and talk about dissent as well. So if we could have Stephanie come in and talk a bit about immediacy, because one of the things we did when we were looking at issues of workplace and how COVID changed workplaces is we looked at immediacy as a way in which workplaces were changed, because really more people went remote. So if I could have Stephanie talk a bit about that, and then we'll turn over to Melissa to talk about what dissent is. Stephanie.
Certainly. So immediacy, when you use the term immediacy, we're really talking about two totally separate variables. And pardon me, my cat really wants to say a few things about immediacy as well. So excuse the side comments. But when we're talking about immediacy, for the first 50 to 60 years that we studied immediacy, we studied them as a set of behaviors that were discovered in psychiatry. And these were behaviors that psychiatrists noticed that when they did these things, their patients were more prone to disclose and they were much more relaxed. And so this set of behaviors that was identified in the US included things like smiling, making eye contact, having a relaxed body posture, using vocal inflection when you speak. So they called these immediate behaviors, and they defined them as any set of behaviors that a message sender could use that would make the message receiver feel physically and or psychologically closer to that sender. So there's been a plethora of immediacy research with immediate behaviors over the last 70 years. But it's kind of an exciting time to be doing immediacy research, because the way that we measure immediacy has taken a big leap forward in the last 10 years. So the problem with immediate behaviors and the way that we originally researched it was that we were taking the set of behaviors that someone else might do, and we were measuring them. So how immediate is your supervisor? How often do they smile? How often do they give you eye contact? How often do they do these things? And we were taking that set of someone else's behaviors and saying that that was equivalent to the message receiver's psychological change in distance. And that's a very big problem measurement to say that someone else's behaviors is the same thing as my psychological reaction. That's actually a two-step process. They have these behaviors, then I have a psychological reaction. And then based on what I perceive happen, my psychological reaction, then I respond. And that psychological reaction to the immediate behaviors and any behaviors that are not immediate, behaviors that make you feel uncomfortable, those all influence what we call now perceived immediacy, which we study as a mediating variable between message sender's behaviors and how a receiver responds to those messages. Now, this is really important because the immediate behaviors, as powerful and influential as they are, they're limited because they vary from culture to culture. Whereas giving eye contact when you're speaking to someone is a very comforting thing in some cultures, it's not comforting in all cultures. So we were limited in our ability to make cross-cultural studies in immediacy urge. However, perceived immediacy, that psychological construct, that's something that's common to all people. It's something that's involved in our decoding process that we all do every time we hear a message. So those are the two variables that encompass immediacy. The end goal of science is to develop theory, and unless you can precisely calibrate the relationships between variables, you just don't have the raw material with which to propose theory. And so we are now getting to that step as a science field in which we can start theorizing about how immediacy works and being able to study it across culturally and also in different contexts, because up to this point, primarily it's only been nonverbal and verbal. There have been very few studies in computer-mediated immediacy, and the handful that have studied in that context have all been in the instructional classroom context. So there's a lot of exciting new things to do in immediacy, like apply perceived immediacy cross-culturally and look at how it works in mediated environments. So, Stephen?
Thank you very much. It's one of those things too, if I may, and then I'll turn things over to Melissa, is as we look at COVID-19 is so much change when people were working, is just to use New Zealand as an example, is when COVID hit, our government shut things down immediately. People were told, I remember working here at Massey, is Doug can attest to this as one of the associate heads, is we were told basically we were prepping, we were preppers basically getting ready to be sent home. And so we had to go from working in offices in our academic spaces and everything to then our offices were empty. They were wastelands. So we then had to go to, home working. And so the issue of immediacy became a way in which we not only conceptualized, but then operationalized the issue of COVID's effect on the supervisor-subordinate relationship, because it then changed. It used to be I could walk down the hall, Doug could walk down the hall, other line managers in our school could walk down the hall and have chats, talk to people. It all changed with COVID. And we saw the same thing happening throughout the world as more and more people to differing levels changed in their working environment. So immediacy was one way that we could operationalize and conceptualize this effect. There's many other ways. There's no perfect way to do it, but theoretically it made sense for us. And we also had one of the gurus, I would say, of immediacy working on our project, Stephanie Kelly. So it was great for us to do that, to look at this, because immediacy is so important between a supervisor and subordinate. The issue of how do we create that sense of closeness and or immediacy. And so the other organizational construct we're looking at in this particular study, because we looked at a few different constructs, was dissent. And so I could turn things over to Melissa to chat a little bit about what is dissent particularly what is organizational dissent. So Melissa, can you talk a little bit about what is dissent? You're on mute.
Okay. There are oftentimes individuals experiences workplace issues, events, or policies, or even practices that they find troubling and they don't agree, or they think it's problematic. So they will decide to whether to express those concerns or not, and to whom they express their disagreement, opposed opinions. So the definition of organizational dissent is the expression of disagreement or contradictory opinions about their organizations. And based on the audiences they express to, there are three kinds of dissent. Articulate dissent, it refers to open direct communication to their upward to the management or their supervisors. A latent dissent is a communication opinions to their co-workers, rather working in the organizations as well, and disagreements to the external audience, maybe some strangers, if you want to talk about that.
I think if we could talk about articulated dissent, and maybe if you could talk just a little bit about why people
most dissent. So I missed what you said, Stephen.
I think we were having some internet issues here or there. If you could talk a little bit about articulated dissent, particularly why people are express articulated dissent.
Okay, so why people express articulated dissent?
Yes, I do understand the thunderstorm coming through Auckland now, so.
Well, articulate dissent is an important source of information that has performance, happiness, or yeah, that could be a practical example, and also helps employees to solve organizational conflicts, increase their creativities. So those kind of benefits helpful for the employees and also helpful for the organizations as well. So that's why people express their dissent to their management. So express articulate dissent.
Thank you. There's been a lot of research on dissent, articulated dissent, particularly in organizations, and immediacy. And what we were really interested in is really looking at how does immediacy predict dissent. And just very briefly, just to kind of run through, we just really asked, supervisors' use of computer-mediated immediacy behaviors positively predicts articulated dissent, and supervisors' perceived immediacy positively predicts articulated dissent. So going back to what Stephanie said, perceived is important. And subordinates online, we also looked at issues of online communication. So if I may very briefly, we drew from the work of Ledbetter et al., looking at online communication, the idea that I'm good at using online communication, I'm comfortable communicating online, I actually like internet, I like Zoom, things like this. The idea that some people are much better online than others, very simply, and looked at how would our online communication attitudes impact these relationships. So subordinate online communication positively predicts supervisor use of computer-mediated behaviors or computer immediacy behaviors, and subordinate online communication attitudes positively predict supervisors' perceived immediacy. And then we just looked at how these relationships differ across these three nations, particularly considering the fact that each one had different levels of lockdowns. And I think George did a really great job explaining the issue that the US really had a very disjointed response. If you look to this, even within each state, One of the things that I'll just add is if you look at the US, there's a federal response, but then you have states, so there's states versus federal. And then within each state, there's also county levels and city responses. So within a state, there could be different responses within the state. And so a very different response than say in England, where the UK has 4 different countries, where England generally had one unified response within the country of England. Like in New Zealand had one response because it's all dictated by Parliament, federal level. There is no regional response, it's all one. Australia had 8 states. Each state has its own response, but they're fairly similar with some divergence, of course. So each one is so different, which makes for some interesting differences for comparison. But it's not neat and tidy. I'll just say that. And if we look to New Mexico, California, and Florida, the reason those 3 are discussed is Florida really was almost like Mad Max when it comes to its response. Governor DeSantis, who was recently at the CPAC conference deemed the new leader of the Republican Party, pretty much said anything goes. No control. California had mixed control and New Mexico had more controls early. So differences. So that's pretty much how those things went. So it's important to see that. And so when it came to the results, just very briefly, and then I'll turn things over to Doug and KJ in a moment here to talk a bit about the significance and where we go from here, is we found that supervisors' computer-mediated immediate behaviors and perceived immediacy did predict articulated dissent positively. So the more I see my supervisor as showing immediacy, the more comfortable I am dissenting upward. It makes sense. Just think, it's almost like duh. But the more my supervisor shows immediacy to me, the more I am likely to dissent to them, to voice opinion, which could be contradictory, because I feel comfortable with them. But what's interesting is this has never been shown really before. So it's nice to actually see it, which is theory building. Second thing is some parts of online communication positively predict immediacy behaviors, but some don't. So there's a lot of room to grow really when it comes to understanding immediacy and perceived immediacy and online communication behaviors. But one of the things we kind of say is there's still a lot of room to understand online communication behaviors because they're changing constantly evolving. Next, attitudes toward online communication did positively predict articulated dissent because we're more comfortable using online communication now. Particularly in the time of COVID, people have pivoted. I hate that word in many ways because one of our leaders at the university uses the word pivot all the bloody time, and I don't like her. But anyway, we've changed. We've learned how to, but it's the right word. We've switched to online communication. And so the more comfortable we are doing that, the more likely we are to be adaptable at communicating dissent to our supervisor. And so that's important. So that's a key thing. The final issue is the idea of national cultural differences. National culture did influence some of these relationships. In each case, the effects of immediacy in particular were larger in the United States. What we're seeing here is that basically, I would argue that Americans generally expect more immediacy. Americans want their managers to show more like care almost, or to show more like informality or show more immediacy than say Australians or those in the UK. And so that was an interesting finding, I would say, because it hasn't been shown before. So that's also theory building. So going into the significance, this is where I'll share the screen again so we can kind of guide this, is I'll turn this over to the rest of the team here. Talk a bit about significance. So I'll open this up now to our next speaker. I wonder if this is Doug or KJ.
significance of COVID on those variables, those constructs?
Basically, yeah, I mean, basically this is where we're, yeah. I think Doug was doing this, I think.
You're muted, Doug. Okay.
Yeah, I just found that out. I'm not sure whether I was doing this or not, but I
No,
think
you're doing the future, sorry. You're doing future, yes, you're doing future stuff.
yes, I'm
Sorry.
doing like practical implications. Thank you.
Practical
Yeah.
implications, yes. So significance, I mean, I can talk, I think the next slide is you both doing the next one. So significance is, this was one that I kind of threw in, so I'm throwing a curveball for everyone. This is me being a manager without much immediacy in this case, or not much focus, I suppose. Is why this and why the study is important is research increasingly shows self-disclosure is a positive organizational trait, which is a form of immediacy, disclosing, talking about yourself. Particularly in the US, it basically increases immediacy. While in other cultures, we're finding that self-disclosure is really not a significant or an important aspect. I can tell you from working in Finland is that too much self-disclosure was seen as very bad and was actually a way to decrease immediacy because you were seen as odd when you self-disclosed. So we really need to look at the impact of self-disclosure on immediacy. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, is how that impacts things like online communication, immediacy, and dissent. In the UK, organizations encourage more subtle communication online, not just direct communication, but more subtle, even forms of writing, which, you know, the dry sense of humor is that form of even responding to things. So less direct communication. Is even that way here in New Zealand, I would say. It's a little bit less direct communication. US and Australian organizations differed in the links between computer-mediated immediate behaviors and other constructs. Freedom of emotional expression, spontaneity and casualness, and independence, self-determination, and self-confidence reveal how Australians are keen to express themselves communicatively. And I can say that even here working in New Zealand, working with Australians, there is a higher level of emotional expression, spontaneity, casualness, independence, self-determination, self-confidence. And that does show in the results. Australians use computer-mediated immediate behaviors to not only express themselves, but develop emotional connectivity. Is one of the things the research shows us. And so going into, we have questions and answers next, but what I'd like to do is talk about future research and practical implications. So I'll now turn things over to Doug and KJ to talk about where we go from here. What are some future research implications and some future practical implications we see from this? So Doug, first.
Yeah, I'm just going to go on the practical implications of this. Is when you think about it, we've all been thrust to an online environment. Yes, we've used online before, but now when lockdowns came, especially here in New Zealand, Australia and other places, we were suddenly thrust into using online. And what the research has shown is that not everyone's comfortable with online. Whether you're a supervisor or a worker, not everyone is comfortable when you come to confidence in using online tools. So to suddenly have this assumption that everyone can just adapt is the wrong way to go. So what I would suggest is that we need to actually put training into organizations in order to help people become more comfortable, both supervisors and workers, in using online tools, so that we can help them develop the immediacy in their online communication, which will hopefully improve the relationship between supervisors and their subordinates, but also just improve the overall organizational communication climate as a result. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. And it's important for, I think, before you could go over the KJ, it's important for us to always think about when we have these kinds of findings for us, because we're looking at that relationship between supervisor and subordinate, is really how can these results help us, if you were to say working in the business world? How could they help if you are, say, a manager reading these results? Is really, you know, theoretically, they're probably not going to care as much, even though they could and they should care. But really, what's the takeaway for them? I think that's why practical implications are important. One of the things as an editor, I've been asking more and more researchers to talk about in their implications is really practical implications. Is really, what does this say to those who are, say, outside of academia? I think that's really an important thing for us to talk about. KJ.
Yeah, so when you look at like articulated dissent, you know, for companies and organizations, it's an important measure, you know, and things that they can use to, you know, when they access it to help make better decisions or increase, you know, employee performance on those type of levels. So like Doug said, when, you know, everybody was kind of thrusted into this online environment. And when you think about like WCA, just the world being thrusted into, you know, changing and to using the internet more to communicate. And as far as immediacy and the psychological closeness, you know, that in my mind, a lot of people prefer face-to-face. And then now, as we go through this pandemic, a lot of people are now transitioning to the fact of they're kind of more comfortable using computer-mediated, you know, immediacy behaviors, but they look to their supervisors in a sense to see, you know, well, what are they doing that they wasn't doing in the office? You know, it's a lot difficult when you can't see somebody every day. Like you said, you can't walk down the hall and ask somebody a question. It's now email or these type of Zoom calls. So for future research, kind of like in the panel last night where we discussed, I would love to kind of do some research on what are people's new attitudes towards, you know, these computer mediated immediacy behaviors, and how are supervisors trained and to be more immediate online. You know, you think about some supervisors, I've talked to, you know, some people who are supervisors or superiors in a certain situation, and they let me know that, hey, I don't really like online as my preferred choice, but I have to deal with it. And so it's kind of like, to me, when I think about it, it's kind of like on both ends, you know, for people who are, you're looking to dissent, you know, it's important that they dissent, but are they dissenting just because of the inconvenience of being online? The inconvenience of they don't know when they're going back to the office, or just the COVID pandemic in general. You know, there's different types of dissent. And so they're having these type of conversations with their family members, people that they work with, and even, you know, to the point of where they might reach out to their superiors and have these type of conversations. So just looking at how we can transition and capture the same type of immediate behaviors or dissent behaviors that we had while we were face-to-face in work pre-pandemic, and kind of incorporate them into the new norm that we have now going on. Because as you see, you know, this structure, you know, this computer mediated immediacy behavior structure is kind of unified, I would say, as far as you look at it in different places. People feel the same ways about online work, about communicating with coworkers and superiors and stuff like that. So since we were able to distinguish that, hey, you know, it's kind of unified across different cultures, you know, maybe we should take a deeper dive into it, because the internet is, you know, is kind of something that everybody uses in their own capacity. I know certain countries have different types of bans and things on things that we may be able to use here in the US, but overall, everybody has to use the internet nowadays. Everybody has to use some sort of computer, you know, to do things, to send emails, to talk to friends, social media, and now to work. So, you know, to kind of look at that and see where we can go forward with that would be a great idea, I think.
Can I piggyback?
Sure.
So to emphasize a point that KJ made, which I think is an incredibly important point, the immediate behaviors being the same for everybody, the factor structure of the computer mediated immediate behavior measure held across all three cultures it was used in. Guys, that has never happened before with immediate behaviors measure. It has never worked across multiple cultures. Doesn't work non-verbally, doesn't work verbally, but the computer mediated immediate behaviors measure worked cross-culturally. So what does that say? You know, is it something that, have we developed a global culture about communicating online? Is this because the internet is unifying us that we develop these behaviors together? Well, why is it that for the first time we have an immediate behaviors measure that works exactly the same way across multiple cultures? I think that is one of the most, in my very biased, I study mostly immediacy opinion, I think that's one of the most fascinating things we found.
Can I just add? Can I add an anecdotal piece that's because in New Zealand we have relative freedom thanks to the different ways we have done things. one of the things I've noticed when we were having meetings online, staff meetings online, that my staff were more articulate in telling me what was wrong when we were in a computer room, right, in a Zoom meeting. And I'm not sure, I only had my first staff meeting after a bit of a break the other day, but it does seem that they're more vocal now in the meeting room, in the actual face-to-face meeting room, than they used to be. And it will be interesting to see whether that carries on. So I think that's another area of research, that when we do go back to some kind of normality, is there a difference? Do they feel a difference in being able to articulate their dissent in a face-to-face situation than they used to be before? So this is just another idea.
No, I think those are all, I mean, for us, I think those are all good points. And I do think it was interesting. I'll just mention is what Stephanie's right, is we had these 3 different countries, which if you look to say the research like Hofstede, Hall and others on paper are the same when it comes to dimensions, but we all, they're not. I mean, working with people who are from England and Australia and the US, culturally very different, but on all the dimensions and all the research are very similar. But working with them, their work culture is vastly different, and economically very different, geopolitically very different, historically very different, even though they all former British colonies, or England and then the US and Australia are former British colonies, still very different in so many ways. And even their response to COVID, vastly different. And so I think we can still see all that's impacting how they respond to the virus, how they currently are still responding to the virus. But then exactly what Doug's saying and what Stephanie's saying, how is that impacting how people answer questions on surveys? How is that impacting how people are going to respond when they go back to work, if they go back to work full time in the office? How is that going to change things? Our university now, and I don't know how Carolyn would feel about this, one of the things our university is doing is they're looking around and they're saying, hey, do we actually need academics in these big offices anymore with all these books behind them? Because we were able to survive for months without it. And guess what? Productivity didn't drop. So maybe we can go more toward open plan and do that. Now, one of the things I've argued is that we're not going to be able to recruit professors, particularly, or associate professors, to work in big open plan because they like their books and things like that. But less and less books are being printed. They're more and more online now anyway. So the future is changing. We're not going to have these old offices with dusty books anymore in them, more and more. Journals aren't being printed anymore by paper. They're all online. So maybe the days of an office filled with a library are going away. So is this like the end of times in some ways that we used to have for offices? I don't know. That's why doing an interdisciplinary work on this is also really interesting to see how this is changing the way we work. It's a big, broader question, but from an administrative point of view, it is changing quite a few things as we return back to normal.
Stephen, when COVID-19 occurred, and I recall vividly from March until May of 2020, being in my office as I am now here at Indiana University, I recall walking across campus and conjuring the idea that in the future, we would have all of these buildings and there would be no people in the buildings, that everybody would be at home. That was a scary thought. It was also a scary thought because I suddenly asked myself, what are we going to do with all the physical spaces that we have in the world? What are the implications of that for us? And how it's going to rearrange the furniture in our heads and present some of the most strong, scary challenges for how we do humanistic behavior in the future.
Yeah, we're looking now even at some of the buildings we have at Massey. We have 3 campuses. Staff are not coming back as the way they should, even though we've never had a big COVID outbreak here, knock on wood. The question is, do they need their offices? As a manager, I'm like saying, no, you probably don't need your offices. I haven't taken that call yet, but the question would be, if we start emptying out offices, part of it could be renting them out to small, medium enterprises, trying to rent stuff out. But then eventually, if no one takes them, what do you do with the buildings?
Mhm.
Exactly. Part of me is saying, you know what? Tear some things down and put some parks up, put some more green space up. Maybe we don't need all of these huge university buildings anymore if they're not being used.
And maybe we could retrofit and move from all this technological stuff to more person-to-person, in-person interactions. I mean, we are malleable human beings. We have fantastical human imaginations. So I don't know why we should just think about going inward inside these boxes as opposed to outwardly in more green spaces and interactive spaces for other human beings too.
Yeah.
Because we are social creatures, as we all know.
Yeah, I'm also a fan of taking some of those buildings in some places and putting them in, turning them into like shelters and turning them into like low end, like housing for people as well, if we can. But something's going to have to be done in some places, particularly in places where rent prices and housing prices are so expensive. But this is a dilemma that's going to probably face us for the next 15, 20 years.
Now, I presume I came in late, but I presume your study focused mainly on elites, or did it include working class people, or what? It wasn't. And by working class people, I mean individuals who did not go to work in their pajamas, but rather individuals who were physically present and had to scrub floors and those sorts of things. So you did include those individuals in your study. Yes. And what were your findings, if I may ask that, with regard to those?
Really a difference between those. If we looked at, say, income, or if we looked at certain control variables, I would say, based on how many people are in the company, their salary, all those kinds of things didn't really impact it. What's been really interesting in all this research we've been doing on organizational behaviors or on prejudice, for example, is often those types of variables, any kind of demographic variable like income, any kind of variable like race in the US, because in other countries, races, they're like, yeah, whatever, doesn't matter what you are, you're French. But any of those demographic variables don't have an effect. The only things that make a difference really is generally your fear of COVID or how COVID influences you. Everything else is pretty much like all the other demographic kind of things, educational level, maybe minimal. Age, maybe a minimal effect, if anything. Sex, hardly at all. Male, females are pretty much almost always the same. Income doesn't really have much of an effect at all, really. So it's really just COVID is the overarching biggest like boogeyman in the room. But we're finding that other researchers are finding the same thing, that because in a time of pandemic, and this is one of the things I think Audra talked about in a panel yesterday, is in a time of crisis, the crisis creator basically trumps everything. So yeah, it's been interesting to see that play out. It was interesting, someone mentioned the idea of training people. I think KJ said, how are supervisors trained when it comes to immediacy? I thought I turned to Stephanie. You're nodding, but what's the literature say about this, first of all?
Well, in terms of immediacy, if you're not an academic, you don't know that term. It's not a common variable. If you hear immediacy, you're thinking timeliness. So it's not something, I think that the immediacy literature is a prime example of the siloing effect we have in academia. We do research, we present it to other academics, we publish it in places that only academics are going to read it, and it doesn't get out to help the people that need it.
Well, think about, like, let me ask Doug and Carolyn here, think about, and even myself, think about the training we've gone through for like becoming managers or becoming line managers particularly, how have we been trained at all, or have we received any formal training on what we know about immediacy or how to be more immediate? Have we received any formal training on that?
I'm talking for myself. I mean, I remember getting an invite into a senior training thing that someone didn't tell me about. But anyway, going through that training, there was nothing about immediacy. There was nothing in there. I learned how to run the place, how the place was financed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how to deal with, well, if something goes wrong, this is HR, this is how we deal with these things that go wrong. But I was not taught anything about immediate behaviors. All of that I've learned through doing neuro-linguistic programming training way back when. But
Nothing from the university.
Nothing from the university, zero, unless I took psychology. That would be the only place I'd find it.
And I concur with that. No training in immediacy whatsoever.
Me too. I concur. And that's an interesting gap. I mean, this is where we might find, if you're looking at future research, if you're looking at the immediacy work, Stephanie, this is where, if we're looking at something, say, in looking at, like, I don't know if communication education or something would be the place for it, but this would be a place where we're looking at a major gap in basically training of administrators, not just in community, not just, in academia, is really the issue. We do so much on basically preparing administrators on finance, HR. I'm not saying they're good. I'm not saying it's good preparation, but we spend so much money on training administrators for A, B, C, and D. But how much preparation do we do on training? How much training do we do on preparing them to actually effectively deliver those messages?
It's a good question. And I'd say probably on average about the same amount of training they get in listening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess
what did you say?
Go on, Stephanie.
Oh, I'd say they probably get the same amount of immediacy training they get in listening training.
What was that?
Listening.
I'm joking.
But I suppose the big question would be, what are the consequences? What have we lost by not having been trained? Has the world gone on in spite of the fact that we were not trained? Were we successful? And if we were successful, then it raises a question of what value is talking about immediacy.
Well, I'll chime in real quick. When I think of immediacy, I think of, personality, and especially when you think about, people like you all who work at universities and have to deal with people around my age or younger who have different goals and motives. So I think that it is important to think about immediacy, because you want your students being able to dissent. You want people that you're working with being able to dissent, because that's how you start transforming and molding not only yourself, but the organization you're working in into the future as far as what people expect. The younger generations, even me just being a TA for a couple of semesters here and there, I see the change in their attitudes towards my attitude, and COVID definitely was a bad thing, but I feel like a lot of these younger people already were accustomed to using like technology and things to communicate as their number one means. And so if you think about that on a level of immediacy, and like y'all were mentioning, training, as far as training people to be more immediate, like I said before, a lot of people don't know, and outside of, like Stephanie said, academia, what immediacy is. So like I bring back personality into it. I feel like people get hired because they have a certain personality that's acceptable for any organization at that. And then especially in academia, you go through these trainings and you're already coming in with expecting to have certain credentials, expecting to go through certain training to kind of mold each individual into the overall vision or focus of the organization. And if you start putting more focus on immediacy, so to say, then I feel like it can get more personal within the people that you're trying to capture, the people that you want to, enrollment studies and things on that nature. So I just wanted to make a little comment on that as well.
You mentioned dissent, and I know that in the United States of America, there is not a great deal of dissenting going on. There is not as much cognitive freedom in the United States and in the academy as one would wish. Lots of people are thinking alike. So where are the degrees of freedom with regard to dissenting behavior? Because at Indiana University, I have to really work hard to make my students have a dissenting opinion, one that is not a part of woke culture, one that does not follow the lines of reasoning with regard to social justice or social injustice. I just find that we are basically thinking alike in the academy in terms of race, ethnicity, gender.
And
If I
just
may.
kind of comment on that real quick, and that goes back to the argument of, of just immediacy and how much people are immediate, or distribute immediate behaviors, because they might not dissent to you, but I guarantee you they dissent to their friends, their family, and other members in a way that you might want them to have those different type of conversations, even outside like the social justice thing. But that's where immediacy comes in, and just having that psychological closeness, I feel, to, I'm the type of person that unless, you have the credentials, or I don't really like talking to a lot of people. So for somebody that doesn't have the behaviors that I can deem that I would talk to them even outside of whatever we're doing, if they were more immediate and showed me those behaviors, showed me those qualities, then I probably would feel different. And I feel like, I agree with what you're saying on this. A lot of people feel the same right now, but I feel like contrary to that, a lot of people feel different about a lot of things. They just don't dissent because they don't have the outlet, because you have this norm of people agreeing with certain things, with different issues, and then it's kind of like you're in the bucket. But what about the people that don't necessarily fit in the bucket, but they're being forced to, just because everybody else is? And I feel like a lot of these buckets filled with people that you may say feel the same way about stuff, they might be willing to consider another bucket, or but it's all about being immediate enough to be able to have conversations and things with those type of people, to see why they aren't dissenting, or to see why they are dissenting.
I fear I must get to another session where I have to judge, so I beg my leave. Thank you for a lovely session. I enjoyed it.
Aye.
I think it also depends on going back to what Carol was saying, on the topic of dissent. Because if you look to the issues she was talking about is more of a race, social justice kind of issues. That's one topic. If you're looking, say, in academia on an issue such as, say, like I still remember the days of being in the US in academia, and I'm sure Stephanie can attest more to this because she's, in this kind of governance kind of spot now, where if you were having debates over, say, budget issues, if you were having debates over, say, contractual issues like in your university senate, I'm sure people are very likely to express their opinions. And that's a form of dissent because it's a university decision. What you'll find in many places, like in New Zealand, people are like, no, they generally don't voice it, because it's kind of just like, they'll voice it not upward, they'll generally voice it laterally and displace, but not upward. And it's the same thing like in the Nordic countries, they won't voice it upward because it's just a matter of, well, who cares? Like they found a whole bunch of mold in our building in Finland, and it was basically, we've been living it like bad mold. And they told us we had to burn all of our books. And I was just thinking to myself, what is this, like Nazi Germany? We're burning all of our books here? Goodness gracious. I actually said that to a colleague and they were like, yes. And we were told we couldn't wear certain clothes to work anymore. We had to like get all of our clothes dry cleaned, and the university wouldn't pay for anything. And when they were saying all this in the meeting, the Finns were just kind of like, and the only people who said anything were the Dutch people and me, the American. We were the ones who were like, no, this is actually wrong. This is not right. And we were dissenting about it and actually voicing our opposition, our disagreement. The Finns were just like, well, what do we do? Nothing we can do about it. And that's just very common because their feeling is, well, it doesn't help, it doesn't solve anything because nothing's going to get done. And so I think it depends on the topic.
And so Ryan Goke and Patrick McDonald published a study in 2018 looking at organizational citizenship behaviors based on supervisor immediacy. And what they found was that, kind of reflecting what you're saying, and also going back to Carolyn's question of does it matter, They found that supervisor immediate behaviors actually didn't make a difference in whether or not someone was going to do their job. They still needed to have their paycheck. They still were going to job for a reason, but it greatly affected their loyalty. It greatly affected whether or not they were going to try to make the organization better. It greatly affected whether or not they were going to offer up ideas to improve the position, whether they cared how the company was talked about outside of work. So they wouldn't, of course it was a US based study, but there was no drive without those supervisor immediate behaviors to try to make the workplace a better place, because there was a disengagement otherwise.
And so I think
And
that,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think that's where it is important that we do have immediate behaviors, because if you don't, you end up with a shoot the messenger. That's where shoot the messenger ethos, organizational climates come from, because there aren't those immediate behaviors. Immediate behaviors are not, I'd like to go one step further. They're not just kind of the nonverbal and the verbal. It's also being able to accept or not accept a different point of view. So it's like being open to different points of view and not necessarily agree with them, but at least hear them out, is where listening comes in, to at least hear. And then even if your opinion differs, and if you're in a place of being in charge, saying, okay, I've heard you, but no, we're still going down this way. Because I think if you get into that shoot the messenger ethos, then that's where you lose the ability to dissent. And I also think that once you get into that, the immediate behaviors of superiors go out the window anyway, because they don't care. So they won't display those. I just don't know if that really makes sense, but
it does.
That's kind of the way I feel. Yeah.
Because also there's different forms of dissent. If you look to the United States, the whole, Me Too movement, the whole Black Lives Matter, all that's dissent. It's just different form of dissent. And so there is different kinds of dissent. We're talking about organizational, but there's all kinds of dissent itself. And KJ is right. It all depends on who people dissent to, who they feel comfortable dissenting to. But I think if we look to organizations like university, academia, it depends on the topic. And I think that what you'll see is in different countries, because of the structure of organizations, particularly just academia, is in some, they're much more like, I don't know how your Senate is at North Carolina A&T State University, but if you have a Senate, can your Senate, I don't know if you know this, Stephanie, but can your Senate override your university president?
No, not at all.
Okay. Same for us. Like our board, our academic board, basically just doesn't serve at the leisure, but basically serves to help the council, which is basically the Board of Regents. So we recommend to the council issues. But does your president serve on the Senate?
No, it's all faculty, but they only have the power to make recommendations to the provost or the chancellor.
Our president, our vice chancellor, and our provost serve on our board. They're both on the board, which is a requirement in New Zealand. So that's another issue when it comes to dissent, is on our Senate, basically the equivalent of the Senate, we have our provost and our vice chancellor on the board. So when it comes to those, there's been discussions, because it's not only Massey, it's all of New Zealand, is this issue of, can we really have articulated dissent freely to our Board of Regents when our vice chancellors and provosts are on the board? The ones that we might want to dissent about are there. So those are other issues when it comes to just the structure of things. It really can make things rather difficult. So that's a difference between the US Senates, where the president or the chancellor really isn't on that body. So they can very freely say, this is what we think, here's our opinion, without that possible unwritten fear or unspoken fear, which may be totally non-existent, but still there. So, yeah, it's a good question.
By the way, Kenneth, I like what you said about immediate behaviors, mate.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got immediate behaviors, you can have really interesting talks and start to learn other people's world view. But if you don't have those immediate behaviors, that discussion is never going to happen.
Right. And like you said, it's also important just from not looking at nonverbal or verbal, just to be able to accept a certain idea, or, you know, because there is becoming a norm. I see a norm in like I mentioned, the younger generations, at least the ones that I come in contact with or see on social media, to where I feel like more people want to have an opinion. And it's to the point to where if you don't believe their opinion, and in this case, if you think about like a supervisor subordinate situation, it's like you can only have so much of an opinion. But it's kind of like your credibility goes down if you aren't able to listen, or just at least listen to somebody. And if you just dismiss it off top, then you won't have those conversations. But Tao really had a good question to Stephanie. I would want to hear the answer to that if I could.
Sorry, I was typing. So that is a great question. And the best answer I have right now, there's a 2019 publication in the International Journal of Business Communication that looked at another presence variable in the supervisor-subordinate dynamic. It looked at solidarity. And they looked at it broken down by leadership styles. And what it found was that when you have subordinates or you have supervisors who are democratic or bureaucratic or laissez-faire, that everything that we've talked about with immediacy being beneficial was true. But when you had supervisors who were authoritarian, who were, this is the way things are going to go, I'm not interested in communicating, all those interpersonal variables that we talked about in the workplace, when you broke down all these models about relationships with supervisors, just with authoritarian supervisors, everything fell apart. And the study essentially comes to the conclusion that when you have supervisors who are not interested in communication, you don't have the raw material to even develop perceived immediacy or solidarity. And so it's not possible to study these things because they really don't exist. The material's not there. So it's a fabulous question.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we're a few minutes over, but we have a 2:30. We have a panel in about 8 minutes. Then we have the closing session shortly after that. What we will do is just, this paper I've got all the comments back from everyone on this paper for the revised resubmit. And I'm just going to look and make sure the issues have been addressed by the reviewers. So I'm just going to do one last check probably tomorrow on that when I get to work, and then work on the revision letter to the reviewers. I think everything's been addressed. There's been a couple of things that are just like, yeah, done, yeah, done, yeah, done, yeah, done, things like that. So we can't add too much with references and everything. It's already 45 pages. So we can't really add much more. It's 25 pages of text, not including references, tables, and figures. So we can't do too much more. That's what happens when you compare 3 countries. It's just the context and everything. It becomes a lot. So I will work on that tomorrow and then resubmit that. That's the plan. So just to let you know, that's where this is at. So thank you everyone for your help on that. Even if you didn't do anything on this one, but thank you though, because it's just part of the long process. So I'll be working on submitting that one tomorrow. So fingers crossed. And the MCQ piece, the other piece, hopefully we'll hear about that one soon, knock on wood. So step by step, there's different ones coming in. Things are starting to hit, like the piece, we just had a piece on Brazil get in, which was great. A few of us were on that one, not everyone, a few on that one. Piece with Tatiana and Alira and I got in on the Russian Journal of Com, which is really cool. They're now a SkyMago Q1, which I'm really proud of.
Wow.
So, I mean, little things are happening. So people are starting to like what we're talking about. I think because it's starting to make sense to reviewers and editors, and they're like, oh, this is actually legitimate. Anyway, so all the best. Please, the next session's got a couple of interesting paper panels, and please, if you can stay up for the final, it'll be really nice for the closing ceremony. So all the best, and I can't wait to get back to the United States to see folks. I really hope we can be at ICA next year in Paris.
That too. Yeah.
Fingers crossed. So all the best.
So no hope for NCA?
NCA, I won't be at NCA this year. November, there's just no way I can get there by November this year. It's just, we probably won't be vaccinated. I probably won't be vaccinated until September, if then. And then November, I know, but never mind, shut up, Doug. You're in an older group, so you're an older group.
Thank you so much for just telling everybody that one, right?
You're an older group. Well, they know you're older than me. So because I'm 29 anyway. So I'm 29 years old. Stop recording.